Hello everyone, Keir Smith here, back with another video, and a video which I'll call Under the Influence, because I'm going to show and talk about 10 albums that were highly recommended to me by friends, family, guys in record stores, and in one case, even a stranger in the street. And prior to these conversations, which I'll talk about, I knew very little about any of these artists or bands, but nearly all of them have led me on a fruitful path of discovery, and some of these albums have gone on to become firm favourites. So I'll show and talk about these 10 albums now and tell you about the conversation that led me to buying them. So I'll start my list with an album whereby I was influenced by a friend at school. I was 16 years old in my final year at school, a big Oasis fan. What's the Story, Morning Glory had not been out too long, but my good friend Alex Marshall was a big Blur fan. Now, back then there was a lot of this nonsense that you had to be either Oasis or Blur, and I was most definitely in the Oasis camp. But Alex kept telling me how great Blur were, and he brought me in a copied tape set of this album, The Great Escape, and I remember taking it home and listening to it when my brothers were out, because they were big Oasis fans too, and as I said, it was either Blur or Oasis, and I didn't really want them to know that I was listening to Blur. Not only listening to Blur, but absolutely loving it. And this has always been my favourite Blur album. I absolutely love it. The singles were great: Country House, Stereotypes, Charmless Man, The Brilliant, The Universal, but there's great songs elsewhere with Best Days, Top Man, Yuko and Hero, He Thought of Cars, absolutely brilliant. And back then, in the midst of all that Oasis versus Blur stuff, this album paled in the shadow of What's the Story, Morning Glory, but this album has stayed with me through the years, whereas What's the Story, Morning Glory hasn't, and yeah, I love The Great Escape. Cheers, Alex. I became really good friends with a couple of guys at my first job who I lovingly call AK and Cade. Now, Cade is about 15, 16 years older than me, but he got me into all sorts of stuff. Elvis Costello. But more important than that, even more important than that, he got me into David Bowie with Aladdin Sane. Naturally, he was surprised that I hadn't listened to David Bowie yet when I told him that I was a big Beatles fan. I think he assumed that I should have heard David Bowie by now. And he too bought me in a copied tape cassette with Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars on one side of the tape and Aladdin Sane on the other side, but I've always preferred Aladdin Sane. Watch That Man, Driving Saturday, Panic in Detroit, Time, The Prettiest Star, a brilliant album. I've since gone on to become a bit of a Bowie fanatic, and this would be in my top 3 Bowie albums. Yeah. Now, this next album came a few years later. I think I was 22, 23 at the time. I was around my good man AK's house. He'd made dinner, we'd had a few drinks and a bit of a smoke, and he casually name dropped the KLF. And I said, who? He said, the KLF. I said, don't know, never heard of them. He said, you what? You've never heard of the KLF? And I went, no, why should I have? I was 22, 23 at the time, so this was early 2000s. The KLF were not around at that time. I'd never heard of them. And he gave me this broad, knowing smile and went over to his CD rack and pulled out The White Room. And we have been together ever since. I absolutely adore this album. It's so good, I would say it's in my top 50 albums ever. And that's no mean feat. Dance, house, hard house, chill out. It incorporates so many styles and genres that are just so uplifting and joyous, and it's absolutely brilliant. Make It Rain, 3 AM Eternal, Last Train to Trans Central, Build a Fire, the title track, an enthralling listen. I never get tired of it. The next album I bought from an old music shop in Nottingham City Centre called Select Disc. It was almost my second home. I'd go in there every week. I got paid weekly then with my hard-earned pay, and I'd buy something new. And I'd get talking to one of the guys behind the counter there. His name was Ben, and he would tell me about all of these great albums that I should be buying and listening to. And one day he told me about this album, Marquee Moon by Television. Again, I'd never heard of them, but he said that this was his favourite guitar album of all time. And me, absolutely loving guitars, gave him, I think it was $8.99 at the time, and took it home. And I will tell everyone until I'm blue in the face about the greatness of this album. And Ben was not wrong. The guitar interplay between Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd is absolutely superb. There's only 8 tracks on this album, but not a note wasted. From the opening See No Evil to the closing Torn Curtain, every song's great in its own way, but the two standouts are the epic title track, and my personal favourite, Elevation. A truly great album, so underrated. Another album recommended to me by another guy I worked with. This was only a few years ago. I'm 43 now. I think I was maybe 41 then. I think he was 60, so he was a good bit older than me, but he loved his rock. He was a big Led Zepp fan, and he loved his blues rock and southern blues rock specifically. But at that point, believe it or not, I'd never listened to an AC/DC album. I was aware of them. I'd heard Highway to Hell, I'd heard Back in Black, I'd probably heard a few others, You Shook Me All Night Long, but I didn't know, I don't think I knew anything more than that. And he laughed at me, and rightly so. Oh, you've never listened to an AC/DC album? Especially after I'd told him all of the stuff that I was into at this point. But he was saying how great they were and how many great riffs they've got, and the guitar solos are epic, and that should have been right up my street. And I remember him singing a song from this album called Beating Around the Bush, and his face just lit up and he was laughing to himself as he sang it and just saying how great it was. So that was enough for me to go out and buy Highway to Hell, and I was not disappointed. I knew the title track, and that's great. Girls Got Rhythm, Beating Around the Bush is absolutely fantastic. Shot Down in Flames is good. If You Want Blood, it's a great listen. And I've since bought Power Age, Back in Black, and a couple of others. Yeah, AC/DC are cool. I dig them. For this next album, I think I was 19, 20 years old at the time. I was on a night out walking through Nottingham city centre, and I was smoking back then, and this guy came over and asked me for a cigarette, and I said, you can have a cigarette, no problem, but you've got to tell me who your favourite singer is, who's got that voice that you love. And I thought he'd say Paul McCartney or John Lennon, or maybe I was hoping he'd say that, but he said Jeff Buckley. And I was unaware. I said, yeah, I've never heard of him, but here's a cigarette and be sure I'll check him out. And this is a stunning, remarkable debut album. It's got so many great songs across the 10 songs that are on it. I remember thinking Hallelujah, the cover of the Leonard Cohen song, before it was popularised by every goddamn artist on X Factor or whatever it was. I thought that was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever heard. Lover You Should Have Come Over is achingly beautiful. The closing track, Dream Brother, has a haunting quality to it, but his voice just went from a rage sometimes to a quiet quiver, and this guy wasn't wrong. I didn't even take his name. I've never seen him since, but this was a strong recommendation, and this is a brilliant album. Another guy who I used to work with, who I didn't know very well, but I just randomly got talking to him about music one day, typical me, and his name was Ashley, if I remember right, and I asked him, what's your favourite album? My favourite question to ask someone, and he said, Violator by Depeche Mode. And again, I was young here, I would have been 18 or 19, and I can't be certain, but something tells me that I'd already bought the Depeche Mode album Exciter by this point, because I love that single, Free Love. But I've always thought if someone can tell you what their favourite album of all time is, and if I don't know it, I'll go and buy it, because if you think it's that great, then there's probably something there for me too. And there was. Depeche Mode are one of the best bands of all time. I'm not sure where I'd rank them personally, but I know I've got all of their albums and they're brilliant. They're amazing. And this isn't my favourite album by the band, but it might be my second or third, because it's got everything. Policy of Truth, I absolutely love. The closing track, Clean. You've got the great singles, Enjoy the Silence, Personal Jesus. It's so good. Let me show you the world in my eyes. I met a guy around about 13, 14 years ago through my brother's then girlfriend, a guy called AD, and I was over at my brother's house and he was there with his girlfriend and my brother was there with his girlfriend. I think they were going to download, if I remember right. And so I met this guy, and again I said, what's your favourite album? And he said Brave by Marillion. I knew absolutely nothing about Marillion, but he was telling me about this album and looking at his girlfriend and saying how this album saved him and how it changed his life, and he was getting pretty emotional as he was talking about it, and I was thinking, whoa, this is a bit strong, but I could see the tears in his eyes and he was just so passionate about it, so I had to go and buy it. And after listening to this album several times over the years, I can see why he would be so passionate about such an album. It's very moving, it's dark, it's intense, it's a very personal thing, I think. And I personally have gone on to become a huge Marillion fan, and this would be in my top 5 albums by them. Living with the Big Lie is fantastic. Runaway, absolutely love the guitar solo in that. Paper Lies is great, but the closing track is so wonderful and very, very moving, called Made Again. I would strongly recommend all of you out there watching this video to listen to that song. It's beautiful. Do you know, I'm sat pondering now for the first time, who do I like more, Fish or Steve Hogarth? I'm really not sure, and that's something I probably should have sorted out by now, but I don't know. Growing up, I shared a room with my brother Craig, and it was great. He listened to Nirvana, I'd listen to the Beatles. We loved it all. We played football games on the computer together, have a great laugh. But then he went down the road of grunge in a rather intense way, whereas I went down the road of classic rock, Stones, Pink Floyd, etc., etc. And Craig influenced me in so many ways, and he did it without even trying, but he was very, very keen for me to like all of the bands that he liked. And he played me Silverchair's albums, Frog Stomp, Freak Show and Neon Ballroom. But then along came this album, Diorama, and Craig was waxing lyrical about this, saying how great it was, one of the best things he'd ever heard. And I think it was with this album that the penny dropped for me. I thought it was an absolute triumph. The band had developed their sound. It was still grunge, it was still rock, but it had orchestral flourishes. The melodies were superb and still are. Classic Rock magazine reviewed this and said it was a powerful and cinematic statement, and I couldn't agree more with that. This is brilliant. Across the Night, The Greatest View, Without You, Tuna in the Brine, and the beautiful closing track After All These Years. And much to brother Craig's delight, it wasn't too long before I'd bought this album and the rest of Silverchair's album. Call me a firm fan. But not all recommendations are good, and I've saved this one deliberately until last. I went to a gig with my best mate Gabba to watch a band called The Music at their homecoming gig in Leeds a couple of years ago now, and we met up with some of his friends there and some of his relatives, and I met a guy for the first time called Joe. And we got on great, and we was talking about all of these bands that we loved, bouncing names back and forth and talking about albums that we loved by these artists. And he mentioned Nick Cave, and I like a bit of Nick Cave, but he mentioned The Birthday Party. I said, who? The Birthday Party, Nick Cave's band before he was Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Never heard of them. And he said, you've got to get this album by The Birthday Party called Junkyard. And I went on eBay there and then and bought it on his say-so. But geez, this is a tough listen. Junkyard. It's loud, it's aggressive, it's gothic, it's a bit manic, it's absolutely relentless. It doesn't stop, it just hammers you over the head repeatedly, and not in a good way. I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to be brave. I'm going to go back to it and listen with fresh ears and see if I can get through maybe a few of the tracks again. And oh man, he sold me a wrong, and this is, as I remember, bloody awful. So there you go, 10 albums that were strongly recommended to me through the years by various people, and some were going to be easy wins like David Bowie. That was probably going to come naturally at some point, but an unknown delight like the KLF unearthed itself, and what a joy that is. And even now, I'm always looking for new music, always looking to be influenced, so please let me know down in the comments section below some of your favourite albums. If I don't own them or I don't know them, I'll certainly give them a go. And as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, bye for now.